Trees are masters of this space. Pale purple aster novae Angliae, ray flowers disposed all around their stems, remind me of New England and its sons, who took these lands and built their farms on them. I think them Potawatomi lands still. They lived here for countless millennia. They were part of the Anishinabeg, a people sharing three fires along with their brother lineages, all one line. It was a time when asters like this bloomed in Michigan on mornings just like this. They are still here. They never went away. It was September 1960. I and all my classmates, second grade, were led across the street from the old red brick school to the new tan brick school, all modern glass, into our brand new second grade classroom. It was as if a new world opened up, and there I was, at the heart of it all. That fall, Senator Kennedy, as he was visiting our little town, campaigning. In January, the inauguration would follow, and a little TV set was brought into that class uncommonly, so we could watch the oath be sworn from an exceedingly cold Washington platform. And I remember Robert Frost, the fact of him, the poet, speaking on that day, and not so much the work he read by heart, because the one he wrote to read was hard to see in winter's sunshine's brightness there. He read another poem instead that day, and now I know it was The Gift Outright. His loping cadences inform me still. The land was ours before we were the land's. The us and ours he wrote about were white. The gift was that these people gave themselves to a land strange and alien till then. It speaks of generosity, and yet the land we took deprived someone of life. Such as it is, that was a founding truth. It was their land, and it is their land still. The arrowheads repose on cotton wool. A small blue box is where they lie these days. I don't know where exactly they were found, but Patsy left them when she died, and I feel sure they came from somewhere on this farm. Indeed, perhaps they came to light when it came time to dig foundations here for this, her house, my house today. It sits above a creek beneath the oaks and maples shade. Now Patsy was my aunt, Patricia Audette, who owned this land some 50 years ago. It was her land because her father was the man who saved it for us to hold when his father-in-law, great-grandfather Albert, could not keep up the mortgage in the 30s. This Albert Guilfoyle came some years before, along with his wife Grace and family, came here to farm this land, but Albert was no farmer, and the land was sandy, and was not the greatest farming land around. Who were the men who made these arrowheads? I can't help wondering about their makers. What was the year? Where did they live? What were the animals they hunted? Did the loss of arrowheads like these occur on a successful hunt, or one marked by disaster? There is no way to know how those days were, nor when these arrowheads were later found. In August 1821, the chiefs of bands of Potawatomi from here were summoned to Chicago to meet for negotiations leading to the cession of most ancestral lands in Michigan. The plow is driven through our tents, and there's no time to carry out our goods and seek another habitation, said Matea, a chief who never agreed to ceding land. Another chief, Topinby, said to Cass, the lead negotiator for the whites, "We care not for the land, the money, or the goods. It is the whiskey we want. Give us the whiskey." The treaty was agreed to. These bands would stay in Michigan for several years. No doubt they found a violent response from settlers crowding all around their lands. The whites would build a state to do their will, and they'd be sent across the Mississippi, but some stayed, living on their native land, where they remain today and share it still. We built our world on what they left of theirs. That world, unrecognizable to me. We have destroyed a world that people loved. We've taken nearly everything from them. Their world, it changed. It wasn't like it was. A plethora of things reduced to one. Was this the way it narrowed to a point and formed a bit of light that disappeared? And Cass lived on in monstrous evil mansions, the founder of the state and greatly honored. Named to the cabinet by Jackson, he'd drive nation after nation from their homelands. His statue stands today in Washington. I hear a sound as immemorial as any sound I know, a whistle from the Pier Marquette, which slows to cross New Richmond Bridge. The morning train, Chicago-bound, with passengers who idly glance at frozen, darkened river as it rushes by before the dawn. Then miles away, I summon up the scene, repeated day by day, a sound that Albert, ancestor of mine, would also have known well, on now so distant winter days 100 years ago, when he stirred out from farmhouse to make sure the animals had food and drink. The treaty signed, the Potawatomi would go, and settlers came to take these lands. My family would not live here for years and years. By 1829, a man named William Butler would be trading at a place nearby the river's mouth. The whites called place and river both Kalamazoo, but what this name might mean is shrouded now. I like the thought that it means smoky water. It seems the sound of native names meant more than what they meant to those who settled here. The state they formed drew lines to trace its bones, snipped up, marked off, the land turned into quadrants, its huge expanse divided and surveyed. The lines they drew would be the roads in future. A land, complete, was measured out like yard goods. The place became a settlement called Newark when they had lost the river's name to some quick-growing town upstream that had been Bronson. Another port called Singapore downstream from Newark sprang to life on dunes that edged Lake Michigan. Its speculators dreamt that it could be the giant port that soon Chicago would become. From off its docks would ship the lumber from the clear-cut trees that generations stripped from forests here. That Newark, named in haste, became a town that they called Saugatuck, a memory Connecticut-born settlers brought from verdant valley that their childhoods knew. The survey that reviewed the lands that would become the state of Michigan reported the place where now our farm is found was in the beech and sugar maple forests, but beside these climax trees there also grew some oaks, black walnuts, tulip trees, and elms. A recollection of this land that dates back 60 years or so includes the oaks and walnuts. They are with us still, but much of this particular locale had been an open landscape in the time of Albert. Today there are some youngish maples here and there, and I've seen some beeches start emerging down below the canopy of oaks. I don't know when they logged this land, but given its proximity to port and river, I would think it would have been the 1840s at the latest, so it's been almost 200 years for trees to reassert themselves as masters of this space. They say initial clearing for a farm was not too easy when the settlers would choose the land for agricultural development. They'd cut the biggest trees to leave to dry, then burn them later on. I doubt this piece was chosen thus. The soil is thin and sandy, unrewarding so, it probably was made to yield its wood, then left, as there were better farms elsewhere. The glacial scoured ravine is something else that would have marked this land as hard to farm. Était une autrefois, or once upon a time. There was another time, not like this one, a phrase that's used in ancient tales that lets us know they're set amid far distant epochs in worlds where what had taken place had not unfolded in familiar ways we know. Those words can signal that imagination must be set free in such a tale or place. For me, the house we summered in, now gone, was such a place from all the realms of time. I felt the presence of times long ago when we would come to visit at the farm, a 19th century domain, a house whose room bespoke another age to me. The rooms, high-ceilinged, square, became a place where times long past remained in living thoughts. While feeling part of it, I knew the past. For me, its realness, palpable as day, allowed me to perceive that things long gone were evident like things I saw and knew. The books were part of that. Upstairs, a door led off the main bedroom to attic rooms, where books were stacked in great profusion. All of them were old. I guess they had been Alberts and Graces. Many books on many subjects, books from the early 20th century. They were a gift, but not intended thus. They were a source of wonder for us all, the children coming to the farm each summer. The magic of the language on those pages was left unread for summer after summer, until an eye picked out a cover. There was a title printed on its spine. A child's hand touched the book. He picked it up and read, abandoning all thoughts but those the book alone enkindled. Its magic was not as common a thing as its everyday associations might let you imagine. Those books on tables I discovered when a door was opened still appear in dreams of mine these days. They stay a revelation. The sound of water indicates its spring. The current murmurs over logs and sand. It runs athwart the banks of Scanning Creek, meandering across the glacial basin. The swirls now splash and break the heavy stillness as snowmelt joins with torrents from spring rains. It yearns to flow down streams and find its way back to the place where water always goes. But now a burst of birdsong fills this space, to challenge winter and the night, those things that sought to silence them. Their powers are at an end, the birds intone, and it is now a time for loving, living, giving birth. They sing first light. It is the day of days. Imagination conjures up a scene. On Butler Street in Saugatuck, a sign's been put up by the village hall. It tells about the early town of Singapore, and when I saw it as a child it stirred up my envisioning and summoned up a daydream of that thriving town, now lost, but somehow still preserved beneath the dunes, an evocation of an age now gone, a place now lost as well. That tiny port, alone and isolated by its lake, far from the centers of the world it thought itself a part of, states united as a single commonwealth of force that sought to annex lands that weren't our lands at all. The sign can still call up a picture now. This ghost town lay beneath the sands, its site a place where mills, hotels, and stores once stood. A bank once issued greenbacks, and the dreams of speculators turned to dust while sand blew in and covered streets and shops, piers, docks, and homes, till shipping stopped and silence reigned. The works of men are larger than we are. The things we make can give us such a rush as we conflate the power we can wield with the much smaller power we embody. For me, this smallness comes to mind each morning. I run along the road with cars and trucks. I think the hunter who crisscrossed this land and lost an arrowhead one day back then could also feel some sense of smallness when he thought about himself in this great space, these woods and gully, riverside and lake. And Albert must have walked this road, a dirt road then, with passing cars, from time to time. His world, a quiet version of today. A century ago, as he walked down to cultivate the apple trees he'd placed in what has since become a forest now. He may have felt his smallness as he glimpsed the fields and creek, the river stretching off. We are so small in size and in our power, the world so big, it makes me wonder how we can make any difference at all. We sound like thunder in our pickup trucks. We are not thunder. Visualizing calls to mind a dream of other times now past, so in my thoughts I gather up a picture of Albert's daily life. When he came to live here, he was a man of 51 or 2. With Grace, his wife, he'd had 9 children. One, a baby boy, died young. When they came here, 4 younger children lived with them in that farmhouse. 2 boys, 2 girls. There was a granddaughter with them as well. They ranged in age from 6 to 16, so both Grace and Albert must have known the ways of care, the weight of caring without means, a life of giving. I think of Grace and Albert embracing in the parlor one night. Imagine a kiss after twilight in a bedroom in the corner. I picture their small granddaughter as she reached up to be lifted. I visualize the sisters and the brothers joking and laughing. I think of the night as it deepened, lights going out one by one. Imagine the days as they passed, a life on the farm, a family who knew each other so well they'd think the same thoughts at the same time. I think of the peace after another day of work had ended. They waited for each other, and then they tended to each other. They kept each other safe and warm, and cared for one another's needs, until their days on earth ended, and they gave the tasks to others. This apple tree has bloomed 100 years, and now this spring again its blooms appear. Think of the eyes that saw these wide-eyed flowers in years gone by, in springs unknown to me. The sunny weather draws the bees. They swarm and crowd around this gnarled, quite ancient tree. I feel a bit of hope when I see it. I sense the tender warmth upon my skin. I think I found my way another time. The generosity of days to come is tangible in every breeze that stirs these evanescent blooms. This moment stays, with memories recalling vanished Mays. This morning smells like lilacs, and it's cool. Their flowers and racemes are single, buds are pink, and open flowers almost blue. They are the common lilacs on the farm. I know them well. I've seen them my whole life. A cultivar grown in the past, I'm sure, late 19th century, and likely French, that someone planted here some time long past. If Albert or another, I don't know. These Balkan flowers, later bred in France, which loved this land and flourished without care, could stand in for my family as well, because we weren't from here, but loved it still, and stayed on here where we have been for years. One time, when I was talking with Zibby, that's what we called her, Mary Grace Guilfoyle. She was the youngest born of Grace and Albert. Amazed at the abundance of the wildlife on the farm as I knew it then, I asked, "Were there these deer and turkeys living here back then when you were young?" She answered no. If there had been that kind of game around, they would have shot them. In a phrase she gave, a brief reminder of their lives back then, a bit hardscrabble, sometimes hand to mouth, but also how economy and its related element, ecology, are gears in the same machine, and their teeth still intersect and drive on the same force, transmitting torque onto another plane. Of course, the farm is wooded now, which it was not back in the days when Albert farmed. And careful watching, as we do, reveals more and more creatures, not just deer and turkeys, geese overhead, the red-winged blackbirds, and the eagles, foxes, crows. In search of insects, the pileated woodpeckers with beaks like jackhammers drill holes in many trees. The turtles seem much older than the planet. The land's condition mirrors our state too. We have no need to hunt the land to live. Therefore, 1,000 species find a place. Thoreau once wrote some words on the same subject. He said, "A man is rich in proportion to the things he can afford to let alone." In evenings at the farmhouse, I remember, from time to time we'd walk out near the barn with bags of paper trash accumulated during the course of living at the place. They brought them out and set them in a basket, woven of wire designed to burn such stuff. The papers burning in the dusk. The sparks would rise and catch against the wires. It wasn't an event of any moment, but was a little thing we sometimes did. There is contented peacefulness at evening, although the task was not remarkable, because we'd gather. I remember it. Back then, there were no garbage trucks out here. There were the kitchen scraps that went to compost, the cans and bottles amassed and then dumped down in the gully, and stuff that we burned. I run through fragrant air right now, arrayed in pockets, in the cool just after dawn this morning. Atmospheric islands, they're from honeysuckle, sweet aroma, not unpleasant, citrusy as they release their scent across the woods and road. Birds sing. Cascading, cavalcading foliage extends throughout this gully, lately bare. The leaves conceal a multitude of things. The gilfoil middens, hidden on the ground. The bottles, cans, that no one wanted then, were thrown in heaps below the edge of bluffs. Today I find them when I venture down, and here and there the rusted cans appear, along with broken bottles and some stuff unrecognizable as anything. One winter I observed a whitish object across the creek among the trees and sand. When I walked down to look, I found it was enameled panels from some kind of thing, appliance, or an implement abandoned. But mostly what they left becomes just brown, and over time invisible to view. The remnants of their lives long disappeared become effaced as trees and branches fall. The placid leaves recall their gleaming rise, or else the rain that fell throughout the night, and intermittent breezes breathe their sighs as sunniness solidifies in light. Then summer's verdant message sends a code. I strain to hear each signal in the noise, so all the sounds I catch can bear the load of shadows telling tales that light destroys. I ponder how the season's startling green can transform weary hearts long clenched by cold. I learn how long-lost vistas can be seen. The freshness of the scene is young, not old. A stunning moment that unveils the truth. A summer that reminds me of my youth. There is a wood where green shade darkness is, beside a field that's always been a field. The field is where the silo stands. It's built of concrete blocks, curved for this special use. The tube is roofless now, and hasn't been a working silo my whole life and longer. It stands in sun amid the tufty grass. A little doorway opens to the north and inside there's a mess of rusted metal. But raise your eyes, and far above you see a sky slice, circular, revealing that there is a day outside, though in here there's not much to sense but resonance of echoes. The glints of light keep bouncing off the water in that way they do, in shards so sudden, jagged gleams, and momentary flashes. It is so otherworldly, so much like our planet always is. And then I stop to wonder what we did to find this glory ours, discerned in light that shatters across the surface of the bayou, this absolutely cool and clement, clear and pleasant morning. There's long-haired grass by the side of the road. It waves and dances with wind's slight motion. The triple branching bracken crowds its space. The wood thrush sings quatrains in the distance. Hear his song, can you hear? Hear his song, can you hear it? Hear his song, can you hear his song? Can you hear it? In 1845, the government first granted title to the farm and other such parcels nearby it to men who seem a bit anonymous. Their names appear as John Ostrom, William Palmer, Thomas Walker. Walker appeared to be the active partner. These principals and their heirs traded and exchanged their undivided fractions of ownership for some years. It seems likely that in those years the farm's trees were cut down, then floated down the river to the mills, and after that the owners had no use for what remained, this sandy soil, bereft of trees that were its reason to exist. Big fires would plague this area like others in 1871, when Chicago, Wisconsin, Michigan would all ignite. In 1883, George Washington Waldo would gather up the fractions from the owners to establish himself as sole holder of the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter, section 23. His name is redolent of history. New Englander himself, born in Vermont, he'd fought at Gettysburg. After the war, he purchased lands around here and he would grow fruit trees, as had become the common practice in this locality back then. I think that Waldo built the old farmhouse, its barn that stood till 50 years ago, and the silo. He had no mortgage, so it seems he had some means. He'd moved then to some fruitful orchard acres elsewhere, where fruit grew much better. Then he'd sell this farm to a man named Elias Ream. It was in 1892, and Ream would have a mortgage. I have the sense that Elias Ream had a much smaller domain than Waldo, and wasn't prosperous. He'd later move to Indiana, where he farmed, and would live out his life, though he'd be buried near here afterwards. The farm would go from him to someone else, his son, who'd lived there for a year or two. He must have farmed it, too. He had a wife and daughter, but it seems Elias Ream still owned the place. Then Ream would sell the farm, transfer its mortgage on to Emily Davis from Illinois in 1911. I don't know what Davis planned to do with the property. By then, Chicagoans owned summer homes in Saugatuck and Douglas and nearby. Perhaps a summer place was all she sought. Perhaps she thought she'd lease the land to farm. Now, Albert Guilfoyle's sister was Estelle. She was the wife of Alvin Reed. I know Reed was a real estate man. They lived in Chicago. Estelle and Alvin back then already owned the Belvedere, a house just north of Saugatuck, a house where they spent summers. In October 1918, she bought the farm from Davis and assumed the mortgage. At some time, she'd also bought another parcel, 50 acres near the farm, which might have been a parcel that was better farming land than the farm was. In 1919, she'd convey a half share of the 50 acres and the farm to her brother Albert and to his wife Grace. $4,000 was the price they paid her. The terms said Albert was to pay the mortgage. It seems Estelle agreed to pay the taxes. He'd farmed this parcel, though he hadn't farmed before or worked the land. The problem was, this land had quite thin soil, even compared to land around here where the soils were not as fruitful as the rich lands further south and west in the Midwest, like Illinois or Iowa or Indiana, lands so fertile the world relied on them to feed so many. And 1919 was the start of what would then become an agricultural depression, with farm prices falling lower. I found the fox's body by the road. There was no wound. I guess a passing car had struck the fox and thrown it to the side. Its fur, so red and multicolored, shone in beauty on the dried-out grass, aswarm with flies who planned to make a meal of it. I took the corpse and put it in a bag. Removal, more respectful, then took place. It's such a shame to live through winter's cold, with all the hunger that those times involved, and then to die on such a sunny day, the best of June, with solstice yet to come. You're animate no longer. You've now ceased to live among us, and I wish you rest. Grace drove her car into the town, and sitting there beside her was a child, one of her granddaughters. Grace made a turn as she came into Douglas, and the car was wrecked. The windshield shattered. Glass and blades had cut the child, including on her neck. There was some blood. So Grace, the child as well, though shaken up, then made their way to see the doctor at his place in Saugatuck. Then Dr. Walker stitched the child up, and he said she had been fortunate. A little higher, and he could not have closed the neck wound. The blood flow would not have stopped. So Estelle Reed would stay here summers, and one year she and Alvin, her husband, drove up from Chicago for a stay in Saugatuck. The Reeds were crowded off the road. Their car kept going, then into a gully, turning over 3 times. The car roof tore off, and Alvin was thrown. Estelle then pulled herself free from the car. She had broken her wrist and several bones. She called to Alvin, feared he was dead. He was unconscious. He came out of it, called to her, crawled to her. People stopped, came to help them, and hurried them to Dr. Walker's. One evening, Albert was drinking. To drink too much sometimes occurred, not just with Albert, but his sons and sons-in-law too, all us men. It happened he was on the porch of the old house. He stood up then. He fell off the edge, landing down below, was clearly badly injured. So Dr. Walker was called. Albert had broken his hip, and this was serious. Albert was older. One could sense the tone was tense between the two of them. "You'll never walk again," the doctor said. "I'll walk again," said Albert. "I'll bury you." As it was, he did. I'd like to know what plans they hatched and shared, Estelle and Albert, what they had in mind. Estelle was 5 years younger than her brother. There were 4 children in their family. The 2 of them were those that still survived when they became joint owners of the farm. They both were born in Illinois. They lived in Colorado when they were young people. The story was that Grace and Albert's sister had met each other at an Eastern school. Estelle became the link that Albert used to meet his wife who was to be his Grace. Before the farm was purchased, Albert was a worker at a steel plant in Seattle. Estelle by then lived in Chicago, and she had become a wealthy woman due to her husband's success in real estate. The farmhouse seemed to be a place where Grace and Albert and their children could all stay. But still, the land was not a proper farm. We see that Waldo left it. So did Reem. Poor soil is most of why they left, I think. They couldn't seem to make a go of it. And then it went to Mrs. Davis, who most likely never farmed the land she owned. The mortgage on the land hung over all those years. It would have had to be paid off at some time with some means as yet unraised, and with no income but the farms alone. The question how and who would do it was a question without any answer then. There are some parcels, heretofore empty, where once within my memory were houses, where there were neighbors back in Albert's time. This season is a busy one for new construction. On two of them, new houses are a building, and both of these are on some land once owned by one Philetus Purdy, local farmer. This Purdy came to Saugatuck in days when logging was the only thing to do. That little town was still called Newark then. He married Mrs. Susan Meade, and they would raise her son, named Henry, on a farm that overlooked the river near Mack's Landing, where logs would float downstream, and later fruit would be shipped out on boats, then taken to the trains, New Richmond trains, that stopped and took the peaches, apples, cherries, berries off to market in the cities far from here. So Fleet, they called him that, and Susan had a daughter too, named Alice. She'd inherit their farm, they called it Riverside, and she'd be widowed by a man named Dawson. So my mother often spoke of Dawson's place. The house burned down some 40 years ago, and Alice died some 30 years before that. These days they're putting in foundations there. Another house across the river road is being built where once another stood. That one was Meade's, and they lived there in times a bit before my own. This couple was, or so my kinsfolk thought, extremely poor, remembering their own existences, which many would have thought impoverished. The husband was the son of Henry Meade, the stepson of Philetus Purdy, and their house adjoined a gravel pit the Purdys had caused to be dug there on River's bank. Then later, someone else would buy the house, and it was torn down after she passed on. Year after year, the pit got deeper while its contents were sold off to pave the roads. They tried to take out every lousy dime till there was no more left to dig, then quit. This place we live, discarded like before, when all its trees were taken to the mills. Land made to pay, to be used up, to change. 1,000 years ago, this was a place to live. The river, creek, and woodland ecosystems allowed the natives to make choices as they gathered food. It said they did not farm, unlike the residents of nearby valleys, who farmed and left maize residue around their camps. But these and other people in this valley wouldn't. They did not engage in building mounds, it seems, unlike their neighbors. The favorable western winds gave warmth for people to enjoy at this campsite. They were a people quite archaic, not a part of agriculture, which was then a revolutionary thing that marked a change in living methods in this region. They did make pots, and it is these that have been found and used to make some guesses toward what kind of people they were, how they lived. The pots are complex, as all culture is. The pots are fragments. What is known is, too. It's strange when one material alone becomes the thing, the unique thing that's known about someone. I'm sure they must have been as intricate as people always are. Ceramic design features stand in for a culture's entire rich diversity. Still, basic facts have been sketched in from sherds. The land surveyed, where artifacts were found, had not been plowed at all, not even once, so not much was disturbed by those that came. Seems we know less of them than anyone. the people who lived here and made these pots. This was to be the town of Breeze that never was a town at all. Swift winds that hustle in from western skies remind me of that place. The treetops dance, the leaves are all asway, the branches flex and bend. That town was not a town, but lines drawn on a map and filed away, its blocks imagined as a thriving place along the river's edge. Around it, enterprise would catch the whole attention of the folks. The only thing they thought to do back then was cut down all the trees, so cutting planks and timbers was their plan for what that town would do. But mills were built downstream, in Douglas and in Saugatuck. The need for such a town disintegrated as the trees were felled and taken. And Albert, many years past then, could feel the winds pick up and storms far out above the lake move in and break the heat, and promised rain, the blessed lavish rain, on which his crops depended, fell once more. But though rain came, the sand dried quickly so the crops would wilt again, and this time rain would pass him by. The farm still suffered from the drought. Another morning. Heat has broken some. The dawn is later now. The year is passing. Light drizzle will confirm the promise of the harvest to the men who raise the corn and beans that are the crops that grow near here. And I am running down this road again, in semi-darkness now, then early light. I wonder if what I will leave behind will tell a story any more complete than what the potsherds tell, or what we learn from gilfoil middens scattered by the creek, those bottles, pails, and garbage under leaves. These forerunners of ours would never know what we would find of what they left behind, that would define them or evoke them to the ones who followed them here on the land. For me, I'll never know what I leave here, if memories or remnants left behind, that will define me or call me to mind. I hope it will be something that conveys the feeling that the times I lived were good, in recognition of the pull I felt to this enduring land and to this place. A pendant moon presides this August night. This globe depends above our lustrous world, a planet far below a sphere in space. Celestial distances are evident, gigantic backdrops vaster than our thoughts, and just as real as trees or creek or fields. Am I the only one who sees this vast, unbounded cosmos as it is tonight? Now this huge ball seems new, or nearly so, a brilliant orb suspended in the void. Intelligent and lucid are the dreams arising on a cloudless night like this. By edge of forest, edge of gully bluff, there is a dodge. What's left of it, the metal, has been all rust for years and years. There's just the two rear panels where the windows were, and some supports left from the framing. It's the barely recognizable remains of my grandmother's car, according to the legend, abandoned in the gully years ago. Now Dorothy, that was her name, was daughter of Grace and Albert. When they came to live in Michigan, it was not long until this daughter and her husband and 2 children would come too, living then nearby, or else with parents at the farm, and often in Chicago, where my grandfather was based. He was a salesman, traveled to make sales. I don't know when it came to her that they, her parents, Grace and Albert, could use help. Perhaps she knew it from the very start, and came to live nearby to them to be the one who could make up the difference when farming could not earn the means required. As Grace would say, to cook was not an issue, but having something to cook was a problem. So Dorothy would drive from town to farm, providing food and other things they lacked. Sure, she would have more cash than they back then. I don't mean to imply that she had wealth. My grandfather was working and kept working, which wasn't how it was for lots of folks who lived through those lean years back in the 30s. She was their second oldest adult child. Somehow she had become a driving force, a force of nature, some would say. The mortgage had to be paid. Estelle, who'd bought the place, had given her share of the farm to Albert. He had to pay the mortgage payments then and taxes. This went on for some time. Then, in 1934, the mortgage was replaced by two the government would hold, a federal land bank. Then some years on, a letter came to Dorothy, and while the bank has been quite lenient, it appears that Mr. Guilfoyle is unable to carry on with the loan and to meet the obligations which accrue, for in addition to delinquent interest, we believe the taxes are unpaid as well for 1935 and 6. Two mortgages came to a total of some $2,700 then. She was the glue that held this family together, so it fell to her to solve the problem with the mortgage and provide a place where Grace and Albert could keep living. They thought of splitting up the farm into two pieces, since that would result in two indebtednesses. I presume there might have been two sons-in-law or sons who could have taken on a debt that size, but that required a move of barns and other buildings. The bank thought this would likely not suffice. They wanted someone to take on the note and not move barns and chicken coops before who would pay down the mortgage was decided. 6 months would pass. The farm was then foreclosed on, but no one seemed to move or leave the place. A year went by, and letters in the file show that my grandfather and grandmother then made an offer to acquire the farm from that same federal land bank of St. Paul. Then 9 months later there appeared a contract where Dorothy and her husband, Mr. James D. Audette, took out a mortgage on the farm from them. A letter from the bank then came. We trust you will be satisfied with your purchase and entirely successful with this farm. No need for that. The farm, its crops, and stock need not succeed henceforward, for from now on it would be owned by someone who could pay whether there were good crops or not. And Grace and Albert could rest safely knowing that they could stay on at the farm for good. They were made safe because their daughter cared. There were not wings, but arms enfolding me. There felt again in summer rays of sun. I call them forth from deepest memory. I was held close to the breast of someone. The lightness of her touch, I feel it still. I can know love because I was a child. A chord, a feeling, call it what you will. Her warm caress showed me a world that smiled. From the love she gave comes the love I give. Unplanned acts, instinctive and sincere. Love shaped the structure within which I'd live, behind my sensing someone who was near. I know it is fulfillment of a trust, to keep embracing others, as I must. It's end of summer, and their voices rise so loud that nothing else could sound so strong. The insects sing a season is a lifetime. The insects tell us we are all together, as this, our season, ends. Their lives continue in days that follow, as they must and always have followed in the years that we've been here. The insects lay their eggs, and there will be some generations yet unborn to come. But all of it is a continuum, and that is what they sing to tell us now. We are a part of all of it that never will come to a crashing halt. It is a cycle life reaffirms forever. There is not an end. Two tales begin with, one time Gramps came back. J.D. Audette, a salesman on the road, and each said something on the key concern of how we were to make a living on this farm that clearly could not make a dime. And Albert plays no role, but is a sideman, observing as the story goes awry. Can I say here, my grandfather was great? A peacemaker who loved the folks he met. He spent his years in sales, but he was always someone who cared, who helped his clients. They were bakers in the small-town shops that then were found in all the suburbs of Chicago. He'd see a man who worked in such a place and tell him that he knew a place where he could run a bakery that would be his. He'd sell him the machinery and fixtures, but he'd be there to counsel when the need came. These bakers called him still in years that followed, for he had savvy, was wise, and he cared. He made a living. Clients did well, too. So one time Gramps came back from on the road with turkey poults that he had bought somewhere. Back then some chickens were kept on the farm. They would lay eggs, They had their coop and either would wander here and there, or far more likely, they had a yard where they would spend the days, but then they would be put back in at night. So these poults were let loose in there, it seems, and then they all took off into the trees, and nothing anyone could do could make the turkey poults return to ground again. So one time Gramps came back from on the road, and he had caught a turtle, one of those big snapping turtles like we see in spring, a reptile, huge, that lives for many years, and he decided that he would make soup. A turtle soup, a delicacy then, was more familiar then than it is now. So put aside the way they must have had to kill the creature, then extract it from its shell. The thought of it is quite unpleasant. The soup was cooked, but no one would partake. Apparently, it just was not a dish that anyone would care to taste at all. So then they brought the soup out to the pigs, and they, the pigs, refused to eat it too. I dream my poem is read out loud. The grid across the land is tuned to play a single note. It resonates when struck, and then we hear that sound. Little squares of fabric in all the colors that there are handed out to those who come to listen, and these recall the myriad persons who have lived on this, our land, this piece of land that plays a single note. And at the start of the reading there, we throw into the air some bits of paper, confetti cut from pages, gray in color, that drift through space. These bits will mark a route, a pattern in the air that tries to recall the creatures, ever changing but still the same, that made a life upon this land, this piece of land, who live there still, living, dying, giving birth, engendering others who live here too. This ritual is just to say, we know we are a part of this same story. We tell this story silently, while breathing, while we breathe. The story is told in every single breath we take. It is a story that won't end with us. As long as there are people here, or animals, or trees, the story that we tell will still be told. A portrait of Albert, the way he was. For this, I must rely on someone who knew him. I did not, but my sister did, and she has shared some stories she recalls. There is a picture of her in the garden Albert grew. She was a tyke, no more than 2 or 3, and there she was along the even rows, and weeding just a bit, a sun hat on her head. And this reminds me, too, that Albert might have been a man whose farming skills were limited, but he was still a gardener, and one who knew what he was doing, as is shown by rows so neatly weeded, stretching off down through the swale, where he would grow his beets and carrots, lettuce, onions, and potatoes then. One time, she tells me, she was walking to the barn along with Albert. I'll set the scene. The dry grass and the sand was what you saw out there. There was a kind of snake that wriggled, probably a garter snake. My sister was a little girl, and so therefore she screamed and fussed. So Albert took a hoe or something similar and killed the snake. Now we can be quite sure that Albert knew the snake could cause no harm. The killing of it was an act entirely due to thoughts of love. The little girl was scared. The killing of the snake dispelled that fear. And there we have a glimpse of Albert acting reassuring as grandfather, papa, and the man providing safety to this child. The last remembrance is back in Chicago. After Grace had died, when Dorothy would come back from the farm, then Albert came to live with them on Mason Street. There was no need for him to stay and tend the animals. There was no stock by then. The farm was quiet, and he likely did no more than garden when he felt up to the task. So winters he would go away. The farm would rest beneath the snow, as he slept in the room they kept for him and dreamt of other days. One time he took the little girl, my sister, walking down the street, down to the park, Columbus Park, as they walked hand in hand, perhaps, among the trees on shaded pathways, and to the lagoon which had been laid out to resemble prairie river banks, the way things were before the towns had been built there. And Albert's memories perhaps kicked in, his Illinois upbringing, and his boyhood in a place that echoed the one they walked through that day, and then the two walked home. The trees are creatures of this space, and they are denizens, inhabitants of it. Back in the deepest part of it is found a hemlock at the verge of Gully's slope. We have few hemlocks here around the farm. I know them, though, because they line the road that leads through wooded dunes to Oval Beach. It's not too large, but all alone, this tree, this hemlock, but I know they're slow to grow. And maybe this one was quite small when they came and cut down the trees and floated them down river back in 1846. A remnant and a master of its space that no one thought to injure or take down, which still lives on unseen by all the world. So it remains a token of the place that this land used to be and will be still. Then in another corner of the farm, remote and deep in woods at Gully's edge, are pawpaws, plenty of them, in a patch. They're trees, these pawpaws, and they're seldom seen. These trees bear fruit. They are a species that have relatives in tropic places but are solo in this temperate climate. The leaves are large and oval like a hand, with fingers closed. They're in a thicket deep below the canopy that oaks provide. These trees can fruit, but these don't fruit, it seems. It's likely that the pawpaws in the patch are all the same genetically, so can't pollinate themselves. I will put in another tree from yet another line in hopes of tasting pawpaws from these trees. They're said to have a flavor like a mango or like banana. I can hardly wait. And then the ice caps melted. Oceans rose. Strong storms were like we'd never seen before, and fires took place that were like storms themselves. Was this the way we ended life on Earth, because there was a profit we could make? Just like those three who bought this land and then cut down its trees and disappeared again. And will the generations yet to come remember us for that destruction only and nothing else? They were the ones who brought these curses down. They were the ones who warmed the earth and left us this unholy mess, or so I hear them saying from the future. As I see nature and its days before my eyes, I wonder if this is what they will think of when they contemplate the years I've lived and loved the world that I could see. And this my life, I tried to do no wrong. Will they regard as part of this whole crime? A world destroyed because we could not act? A year has passed, and asters are again in bloom by sides of roads. And I reflect how little I still know of Albert, how he felt, and what he knew and what he did. Sometimes a history can seem much like a cobweb that a spider builds. It's stretched across what must, to it, seem like a chasm, vast and endless it can move around. It catches some things in the wind, but many more it leaves uncaught. So what we know of times past by is like the tiny insects stuck into this web, but many more pass through the web and fly on safe. Because we know part of the tale, it doesn't mean the rest is like it. One day in 1953, I know that Albert died, and then a heart stopped like a clock, and what he could have told me then was lost. I won't be able ever to discern what he would most have wished, to tell someone like me who sought to tell his tale. Yet I can still attempt to tell what I have always felt about the people that I knew. It was in that unending world of love that I was born and lived till now. And Albert was a person who helped build that world, as we all do from day to day. We build it for the ones who come. Pale moon at morning, fading as I run,